Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the second in our series of medieval work in progress seminars for this year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Antony Eastmond, who will be known to many of you connected with the Courtauld. Tony has published widely on aspects of Byzantine art and culture, understood in its broadest sense. In fact, he's played an important role really in expanding the boundaries of what we think of as Byzantine art, and especially thinking about what constitutes a centre and a periphery in the wider Byzantine world. He's working at the moment on a big project, a kind of really a history of Georgian art, although that is somewhat on hold at the moment because he's rather heroically returned to his former role as dean here at the Courtauld for 1 year following after Alex Bovey ended that role this summer. So he's extremely busy with all sorts of other things. So I'm hugely grateful to him for offering this paper, which forms, he tells me, part of a kind of a wider project on the Khakhuli Triptych, which you'll be seeing, I think, in several moments during his paper, as part of really a kind of a project to think about enamels in the Byzantine world, not least because they're, as he says, very shiny and pretty. But I suspect that hides actually a much deeper engagement with them. So thank you very much, Tony, and perhaps we can welcome him.
Yeah, don't get your hopes up, it is all about shininess. So, thanks everyone. So this is part really of a project to synthesize what we know about Byzantine enamels. A number of people have promised books on them, but really since Klaus Wessel in 1966, there hasn't been a kind of really solid study of Byzantine enamels. And it strikes me that it's time that there was one. So it began with me doing a census of Byzantine enamels. So I start off with the stats. So currently I've logged 1,558 Byzantine enamels in collections around the world. I reckon there's probably about another 50 to go, but they're largely pendants and earrings, the ones I haven't yet got hold of. So that's one project, and the other is, as Tom said, is a project run by a colleague in Tbilisi on the Khakhuli Triptych, on which I'll be talking a bit more later. But the other statistics that you need to know are that just two objects, both of them made between about 1105 and 1130 or 1140, contain almost 20% of all the known Byzantine enamel plaques to survive. The first is the Palladoro, made for the Dogal Chapel of San Marco in Venice, and the second is the Khakhuli Triptych, made for Gelati Monastery. And indeed, just about half of all known enamels, so to be precise, of my list so far, that's 49.4%, that's the last statistic, of all enamels can be found in just two cities, so in Venice and in Tbilisi. So in theory, it is easy to get a grasp of the world of Byzantine enamels, except of course the Tesoro in Venice is closed and the treasury of the Fine Art Museum in Tbilisi is also closed, so you can't. But in theory at least, you could. So these two really formidable concentrations of enamels demonstrate the visual power of the material, the reflective brilliance of its gold and translucent glass, the richness of its colour, and the virtuosity of its craftsmanship. And they show the importance of the medium as a technology of piety and as a visual manifestation of power, wealth, and status. And interestingly, both objects lie beyond the western and eastern borders of Byzantium. Yet despite that, they're both intimately tied to the empire, the recognized source of the vast majority of their enamels in both cases. And more precisely, I think both are linked to ideas of Byzantine imperial power. Both include depictions of members of the imperial ruling family, and so on. And this paper this evening is trying to explore the status of enamel as a medium. and really ideas about how power can be abducted beyond the borders of empire. So there's an intrinsic link, and always has been in scholarship, between enamel and the imperial world. And it's really a foundational tenet of their study. So Jules Labarthe, in his 1872 study of the industrial arts, concluded, in my very bad translation, as the emperors reserved for themselves without doubt the exclusive right to manufacture enamels. Now, that view was very quickly challenged by Nikodym Kondakov, and more recently by Paul Hetherington, who set out the evidence of the non-imperial ownership of enamels, but it's still, I think, fundamental to the way they've been understood, and it's that I really want to explore. Now, the idea of the imperial nature of enamels is very easy to establish. You only have to look at the True Cross reliquary in Limburg an der Lahn, with its central cross commissioned by Constantine VII and his son Romanos II, and then enshrined in the magnificent enameled reliquary by Constantine's illegitimate half-brother, Basil the Proedros, so giving it a date between 963 and 985. This is one of the hallmark pieces in the world of Byzantine enamels. And I think when you look at this and its intimate association with one of the touch relics of Christ, so the most precious objects available, I think we need to think of enamel really as figured gemstones. So not quite as precious as rubies and emeralds, but able to capture some of their luster and to present that in the figured guise of God and his saints. So in what follows, I want to think a bit more about the imperial nature and imperial control of Byzantine enamels, and about our ideas about whether there's an existence of a market in the luxury arts in Byzantium and beyond, and what that says, how that affects their status. So who controlled the market in enamels, and what are the consequences for thinking about the meanings that enamels contain, depending on our results? So the object that establishes the paradigm of enamel as a weapon of a period of imperial hegemony is the Holy Crown of Hungary. So almost 1,000 years after its creation, it remains the key symbol of the Hungarian state, under constant ceremonial guard in the central dome of the Parliament building in Budapest. So the crown, and you've got the one photograph I can find with its later Latin arched crown removed, lower left, depicts on its front Christ between archangels. It has warrior saints on the sides, and then on the back it has the famous triptych of portraits of the Emperor Michael VII Dukas, his son, and the local ruler of Hungary, Géza I. So dating it fairly precisely to around 1074 to 77. Now, there are lots of controversies about the manufacture of this object, not least there are problems about the way that the plaque of Michael VII is attached to the object, which has led to all kinds of debates about when and how it was made. But the latest analysis has concluded that the version of the Greek crown that we see today must have been essentially the same as that was delivered to Hungary in the 11th century. So I think we can be fairly confident now that what we see today isn't some confection made in Hungary, but is what was delivered to the Hungarian ruler in the middle of the second half of the 11th century. So it seems to have entered Hungary as part of the celebrations of the marriage of Géza I to a woman we only know as the Sinadene, so the unnamed daughter of the sister of Nicephorus Potaniates, the man who in a coup is going to oust Michael VII towards the end of his life. So as an imperial gift, sent probably for them to celebrate the marriage or maybe the coronation of Géza and his Byzantine bride, it conveyed its meaning through its materiality, its function, but more especially its specificity. And we know that by the 1070s, enamel had been associated with imperial splendour for more than a century. You've already seen the Limburg True Cross reliquary, but we can find other records of it, particularly in the Book of Ceremonies compiled by Constantine VII in the 950s. So that text describes the churches, the chapels, and the storerooms of the Great Palace being emptied to decorate its audience halls for embassies. And so just to quote one example is from the embassy of the Umayyad Caliph Abdalrahman III of Cordoba, who visited on the 24th of October, 946. Is that the anniversary? No, not quite, but pretty close. Maybe I set it up for that reason. But from that we learn that in this instance, the enamelled objects from the Phylax were hung in the pergo of the Magnarum, in the arcade created by the decorators with great scaramangia. In the 8 vaults of the Chrysotrikinos were hung the imperial crowns from the Church of the Most Holy Theotokos of the Pharos, and the other churches of the palace, and various enamelled objects from the Phylax. So this is just the 2 paragraphs with the most references to enamel objects. But it gives us an idea of the way these objects are being brought out to impress visiting dignitaries, in the same way then that they can be exported to Hungary to convey that same idea abroad. And I do wonder whether the votive crown of Leo VI, now reused as the base of the Grotto of the Virgin in the Treasury of San Marco, is actually being referred to in that text from the Book of Ceremonies. Is this one of these decorative crowns taken out of the chapels of the Great Palace and then used to adorn all its more secular spaces for visiting dignitaries? So I think the function of the gift of the crown to Hungary was a core element in its meaning, whether it was for the wedding of the Synodene to Geza I or for the coronation. The crown placed both the king and his bride amongst the international fellowship of kings and acted as a public affirmation of that elevation. And I think the inclusion of an enamel, should we call it a portrait of Geza I, gave that gift a specificity that showed the individual attention that the Hungarian king was being granted by the emperor. This was very much a bespoke creation, especially to flatter this man. But of course, at the same time as elevating Geza, as has been well established, the enamels of the crown simultaneously undercut that status in quite brutal ways. So whilst his incorporation into that fellowship of kings is celebrated through his presence in the enamel and his title as the faithful king of Turkey, at the same time, the enamel also embeds his subordination within a Byzantine hierarchy. He's always portrayed in an inferior way to both Michael VII and his heir. So you just look at Geza's lack of a halo, the lesser crown without prependulia that he wears, the use of black lettering rather than red for the inscription, the use of a word for king coming from a Slavic root rather than a Greek one. He's a Kral, not a Basileus or anything else. Indeed, his inferior position on the crown below the left hand of the emperor. And also what I like best is his seemingly jealous gaze across at the man he clearly wants to be, all serve to put him in his place. But even taking all those visual barbs into account, the crown shows the care that the Byzantines were taking to cultivate Geza as an ally. And I think that becomes clear when you compare it to other less considered, shall we say, imperial gifts. So these are expensive in terms of their material, but they lack the customized nature of the crown, and they feel more like objects pulled almost at random from the imperial storerooms and treasuries. So just 2 examples in this category. One might be the 13 enamels that now decorate the cover of the Pericope book of the Roman Emperor Henry II from the beginning of the 11th century. So these are the smaller enamels, and they're joined by locally made German enamels in the corners. Now, though the 13 enamels of Christ and the Apostles have most plausibly been identified as being part of the imperial dowry that accompanied Theophano, the niece of John Zimisces, on her marriage to Otto II in 972. After her death, they must have remained in the imperial treasury until Henry decided to reuse them. Now, some scholars have suggested that maybe this was her bridal crown, although I'm not quite so convinced about whether the iconography, I'm not sure, quite fits with that. But whether they were from a crown or a reliquary or book cover, they clearly represent, I think, the expense that accompanied Theophanu on her way, maybe to cover the fact that she wasn't quite the daughter of the emperor that the Germans were expecting. So although it's extraordinarily valuable as a set of enamels, they are perhaps just a kind of generic gift as part of that, from a reasonably standard kind of very expensive object. And the second example in this group is, I think, the enamels that we can find on the Khakhuli Triptych, now in the Pierpont Morgan Library, and now super shiny since they've taken its velvet centre away and replaced it with gold. So these are most plausibly linked with the visit of Abbot Wibald of Stavolo as ambassador of Frederick Barbarossa to the court of Manuel I in 1155-6. That was his second visit. He died on the way back from that, but these clearly made it home with them. And again, these look like objects, so they're two small objects. They're possibly different in date, although no one can be very precise about that. But again, it looks like things that maybe they nipped into a cupboard to bring out as a gift to the emperor or his ambassador, abbot. Now, presumably what Wibald was most interested in accepting these was the relics of the true cross that they contain, and you can see visibly in the larger of the two triptychs down below. And given that access to the relics of the true cross was largely controlled by the emperor, this once again turned enamel into some kind of signifier of imperial power. And I think Wibald's decision to enshrine both the enamels and the relics in the new triptych he commissioned back at Stavolo emphasizes the enamel's role as both the spiritual authenticators of the relics, but also of their imperial link, which I think is a kind of a secondary form of authentication. And I think the idea that we get of perhaps these vast storerooms of these extraordinary objects with inevitable hyperbole comes from the account of the gifts given to the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir in 1046, when we're told that Constantine IX gave him a gift of 50 mules worth of gifts, including enamels and so on. So the quantities, I think, can be accounted for in many ways. But once you set up this idea that there's this variety of imperial gifts, things seem to start getting out of hand. So the amazing True Cross reliquary now in Esztergom, and most plausibly recently dated by Paul Hetherington to probably the 13th century, is still often given in accounts as being an imperial gift to Bela III in 1190. The argument being, how else do you account for the arrival of such an amazing object in such an obscure place unless it's through some kind of royal level contact? And even much more minor objects have been kind of corralled into this. So a series of earrings have been excavated on Crete. This is the one on the left with Arabic inscriptions on them. But the most recent account of enameled earrings identifies their similarity to enameled earrings excavated at Preslav in Bulgaria, and considers that kind of diversity of geographical find spot for two objects has to be predicated on some kind of idea of a centralized and therefore presumably imperial production. So it's very much a world which is kind of narrowing down where enamels come from and who is able to produce them. And it's at this point, having set that up, that we can turn to the Khakhuli Triptych itself and consider the slightly more ambiguous place in this spectrum of gifts that the enamels play. So the enamel of Michael VII, so the same ruler that you saw on the crown of Hungary, but this time with his Georgian bride, usually known in Western sources as Maria of Alanya. So that's the enamel that you find up here, the crowning the center point of the triptych. Well, I'm sorry about the way it's mangled the Greek, but anyway, never mind. Shows, I think, some of the links. It has some similarities with the Hungarian crown. So it's got some of the specificity in terms of it's got a depiction of the current ruler, and it includes the daughter of the King of Georgia, so Bagrat IV. This is his daughter Marta, known in Greek as Maria, who he married in 1065 and subsequently acceded to the throne in 1071. And so the iconography of Christ crowning the couple, the inscription that accompanies it, kind of reinforces the idea of the imperial nature of enamel. But equally, you could see this as a rather kind of an inward-looking enamel, this particular one. It's only about the imperial couple in Byzantium. It makes no reference to Maria's Georgian family. There isn't an enamel of her father or her brother then about to accede to the throne. Suggests that maybe this is something that was more internal, for an internal market in Byzantium, that has somehow ended up in Georgia at a later period. It's not this bespoke object that it might have been. And you can compare it to other objects of a similar ilk, so the enamel crown of Constantine IX, Zoe and Theodora, also found in Hungary variously at times in the 19th century. So these seem to be objects that are not particularly especially geared for the market to which they're going. But this is just one of the enamels on the Khakhuli Triptych. There are another 117 that we need to account for alongside it. And the very important study in the 1990s by Titos Papamastakis identified that the other enamels on the triptych came from at least 12 different Byzantine objects which are being dismembered and remounted on the surface of the triptych. So it included probably 2 crowns, so one including the enamel of Michael and Maria, but with a deisis and archangels. There was a second crown which included the Archangel Michael and the Mother of God with warrior saints and Christ, which is possibly also from another object of imperial regalia. There are items which must have once either been a book cover or a reliquary, so a set of 9 enamels focused on the Mother of God, which bear an uncanny resemblance to those on the Limburg True Cross reliquary, suggesting a link with those. And then there's a 4th, slightly weirder group, which I'll come to in just a moment. So it looks very clear that at some point, presumably between, or possibly between the reign of Maria in Byzantium in the 1070s and the creation of the Khakhuli Triptych in its current form, which took place in the 1130s, a huge number of enamels have arrived in Georgia. And unlike in Hungary, where they have sought to enshrine those enamels and the object they came with as a key part of their ceremonial regalia, the Georgians have taken a very different approach, which is they're more concerned with the central icon of the triptych, and they've been happy to dismember all these objects and to use them to their own ends. And as I say, 118 enamels on the Khakhuli Triptych. So there's an argument about whether some of them are locally made. A few of them certainly are, but the majority, I think, are coming from Byzantium. Shows just how much had been coming to Georgia in this period. And we get one clue about how this might have happened from Michael Pselos's account of the affair of Constantine IX with a Georgian princess, possibly a woman named Gurunducht, but almost certainly the sister of Maria of Alanya. So this is 20 years before she came to power. So again, his vision is no doubt hyperbolic, but both in terms of the account he gives of the wealth of the imperial treasury, but also how much of it was being shipped out to Georgia at the time. So it's a long account, but just to read one bit from the middle. So once more, all our treasures were wasted away and squandered. Some were scattered inside the walls of the city, others carried off to the barbarian world. For the first time in its history, the land of the Alanians, so the Georgians, was suffering from a surfeit of good things sent from our Rome. Their ships sailed into our harbour, and when they put out to sea again, they were fully loaded with precious objects belonging to us, things that once made the Roman Empire an object of envy. And you kind of put that up against the wealth that you see on the Khakhuli Triptych, and you kind of feel there's a truth underlying what Psellos is saying. And above that, you see 3 medallion enamels on the Khakhuli Triptych, which belong to another set. Must originally have had 4, one is now lost, but these are a really extraordinary group of uninscribed enamels, but all showing empresses. So one, an empress seemingly the victim of the Annunciation, one, the empress in conversation with John the Baptist, and one, a pair of empresses being crowned by the Virgin. And endless debate, given there are no names. Are these sisters, mother and daughter? Is this Zoe and Theodora? Is it Maria and her daughter? There's all kinds of scenarios possible, but presumably again from another piece of royal regalia, and it seems to lend kind of weight to the idea that maybe these are objects being transferred through the agency of the Georgian women who are particularly prominent at the Byzantine court between the 1040s and the 1070s. So Constantine IX's generosity to his mistress, however, can't account for all the enamels on the triptych, and some of them, such as this 2 sides of an Encolpian cross with a bilingual Georgian and Greek inscription which names a man named Kvyrike and gives him 2 titles. So he's Magistros in Greek, and he's given the title of king in Georgian, with my favourite kind of inscription in Georgian. It just says, Christ big up Kvyrike the king, in its most literal translation. Suggests that this is coming from other sources, and this is the first hint about how much enamel might be being made outside the walls of Constantinople. Now we have a choice of at least 4 Kvyrikes who would fit the titles that appear in that inscription, but all of them were men who ruled the eastern Georgian province of Kakheti, which was conquered by David IV in 1104, and it's David IV who begins work on the Khakhuli Triptych. So I think this then becomes not only evidence of a local Georgian enamel industry, but also of the way in which these other enamels are being incorporated into a similar kind of imperialist endeavour in the way that they're being incorporated on this triptych in a way to glorify the Georgian kings. So the Khakhuli Triptych originally came from the central icon came from a small monastery in what's now northeast Turkey, but it was moved sometime after 1106 when Gelati Monastery in western Georgia was founded. It's part of a grand kind of Byzantinizing endeavor. It has a hospital, an academy, and a series of other buildings. It's decorated with a magnificent mosaic, one of very few in Georgia, and we have this one surviving photograph from the 19th century showing the triptych in its location just outside the apse. Like, God knows how they managed security on an object in a location like that, but it had a real prominence and presence in the building, and there's a 17th century Russian account which also places it in the same location. So I think it's almost certainly been there ever since the 12th century. And so in this context, you can see the Khakhuli Triptych in terms of the way it's playing with ideologies of power that it's taking from the Byzantine world. So it's literally taking Byzantine wealth and remaking it to new Georgian ends. And I think their willingness of the Georgian rulers to dismantle these objects in order to be able to do that shows what a different attitude they have to the Byzantine centre than we find to the west. And this is a picture, just briefly, to show you that we can portray much more widely. So an icon now in the collection of St. Catherine's Monastery portrays the Georgian ruler with calling him the pious emperor, admittedly with a slight tweak of pious emperor of all the East, but here showing with him with St. George. And I think this then sets an agenda that is then being followed by other members of the Georgian court. And I'm sorry, I'm stealing this slide from Irakli's thesis. I hope he forgives me for this one small point. But you can look at works like the Gelati icon commissioned by Slimon Chikondideli, so the chief minister at the period, who is then commissioning new Georgian enamels to decorate the frame of the icon. So only 5 survive on it today, but again, the 19th century photograph shows that the enamel of the archangel was originally in the top right-hand corner. And so I think here we've got the idea that now there's an attempt to domesticate the nature of Byzantine enamels to use them amongst the Georgians. So I think this is an object that you have to see in reference to the Khakhuli Triptych to understand why it was important to make and decorate the icon in this way. So ignore the face of Christ, and if you're captivated by that, that's probably 18th century repaint. But in all these cases, the power of enamels is lying under their assumed origins in imperial control in Constantinople. And it's that idea of their provenance in the great city that gives them their allure, it's their guarantee of their technical accomplishment. And their treatment by their recipients, whether that's disruptive reuse or reverential respect, is where they derive their political meaning from. And that kind of sets up one model for understanding them. And now if we turn to the other great compilation of enamels, so the Palladoro, we see a slightly different picture. So this is the great set of enamels in San Marco in Venice, made for the high altar, either as its antependium or as its rerodros. So the 3 dates we can roughly assign to the lower 2/3 being from 1105, the upper third belonging to its remodeling in 1209, and then the Gothic framing added in 1345 by Andrea Dandolo. And there's a question, there are 60 odd enamels on the frame, and the question is to what stage of the object, where did the Venetians find a spare 67 enamels just to put on the frame of this extraordinary object? Now it seems to follow many of the same tropes that we've seen so far, but I would argue that it was commissioned in a rather different way that requires a bit more investigation, in that rather than being a gift from the Byzantine emperor, this was a work of art commissioned from Venice. The Doge or de la Falière, we're told, sent to Constantinople to have it made and delivered to Venice. Now that's recorded, admittedly, much later in Dandelot's 14th century chronicle, which it describes the act of the commission, but it does read in a very familiar way to what we know from a much earlier source about the commissioning of the first altarpiece of San Marco, where we're told that Pietro Orseoli, at his own expense, ordered a wonderful work of silver and gold to be made in Constantinople for the altar of St. Mark. So this suggests a rather different reading in which people can go to the city in order to commission what they want. And indeed, there is one other very famous example of this, which is almost certainly the example that Ordelafo Falière was copying, and that is Abbot Desiderius of Monte Cassino, who, we are told, sent one of his brethren to the imperial city with a letter to the emperor and 36 pounds of gold, and had there made a golden antependium decorated with beautiful gems and enamels. And in these enamels, he had represented some stories from the New Testament and almost all the miracles of St. Benedict. And so significantly, it's clear that Desiderius's commission, now lost, but also Falière's altarpiece, required images that were designed in the West and then executed in the East. After all, how many people in Constantinople would have had any interest in the story of the theft, the transfer of the body, and then the burial in San Marco of the body of St. Mark? They must all have been things that were being sent from Venice to Constantinople, and equally the life of St. Benedict must have had a similar thing. Now we know that this is an established work practice in Constantinople, and it had already been in use for about 30 years in the commissioning of bronze doors from Constantinople for the churches of Italy, mostly coming out from the rich families of Amalfi. So whilst at first sight you look at the doors of San Paolo Fuori le Mura in Rome, and you see, oh, we've got a familiar set of Byzantine feast images, along with images of the martyrdoms of the apostles. These are things that would have been well known and easy to reproduce for a Byzantine artist. Even a commission like this also included another number of panels, the donor image, and the long texts that record the nature of the commission that could only have come from Italy. And equally, if you look at the doors for Sant'Angelo at Gargano, they have 3 very local legends that wouldn't have been known there. So there's some mechanism by which either drawings or descriptions are being taken to Constantinople and then executed. But the question still remains, is this then just an open market that anyone can turn to, or is it one that operated with some kind of restrictions about who was going to be allowed to commission and export art from the great city? Now, I think there's some evidence that there must have been, to some degree, a reasonably open market. So in 1113, and it's interesting the way all these stories concentrate in a very small period of time, the scribe and artist Naslav travelled from Kiev to Constantinople, specifically to purchase enamels, which he then used to decorate the copy of a Gospels commissioned by his Tsar, Mstislav, so now in the Historical Museum in Moscow. And I'm afraid these are the best photographs that I'm able to find of it to show today. You'll see why it's annoying. But he even includes a colophon in the manuscript, which explains, as ever, the pain and trouble he took. But it describes his journey to Constantinople, the purchase of the enamels, his return to Kiev, and his completion of the manuscript there. And given that we know that Kiev has a reasonably thriving enamel market, so we have even surviving matrices from Kiev that were being used to kind of outline the enamels, so for some form of mass production, there was clearly a virtue in him travelling to Constantinople with much pain and grief in order to commission them. Now, the book was covered in the 16th century, but I think we can assume that the enamels are original, and it does include two. I'm afraid these are the men. You can only see their top halves, but you can see they wear natty hats. Those are almost certainly St. Boris and Gleb, who had only recently been canonized in Kiev in the 1070s. And so again, this is most likely an iconography that's being taken from Kiev to Constantinople in order for it to be executed. So whilst I think at one level maybe there was an open market, I think at another we need to be rather more cautious about that for both Desiderius's commission and for the Palladoro. That if we look at the Palladoro first, it does of course have its recognition of Byzantine imperial power on it. So a sequence of 5 spaces along the lower edge of the object, 2 now replaced by the 14th century inscriptions, but a likelihood then of 5 enamel figures there, the Empress, the Virgin in the center, to either side Doge Ordelafo Falier and an Empress Irene, and then the possibility of 2 other figures beyond, and perhaps by analogy with the Crown of Hungary, we would assume maybe Irene's husband, so that's Alexius I Komnenos, and maybe his heir, John II. So if that was the case, then it would then encode the same kind of hierarchical meaning in the Palladoro as we've seen already in Geza's crown in Hungary, and as the wonderful article of David Buckton and John Osborne has, I think, proved conclusively, when you look at the head of Ordelafo Falier, you can see how awkward it is, that it's clearly been changed, and from behind you can see that a new head has been placed on it, and it only makes sense to read that as being an original plaque showing Ordelafo without a halo like Geza had, and then the Venetians, presumably in 1209, when one of Falier's descendants is procurator, upgrading his ancestor to have a halo. I think all the other theories that this was originally Alexius and has been converted to Ordelafo just don't make sense. I think it's inconceivable that you'd be able to change the inscriptions without destroying the whole plaque. So I think, again, this clearly Ordelafo wanted the portrait of himself, but when it came back, whether he wanted it or not, he had the imperial family to show him who was really in charge of his commission, and he had his inferior place in the Byzantine world commissioned. And the same you can find when you read more of Leo of Ostia's account of Desiderius's commission, because he goes on to write that the Emperor Romanos IV received our brother very honourably and treated him and his companions honourably and reverently as long as they stayed, and he granted him all possible facilities for whatever he wished to have executed. So it does make it sound like 36 pounds of gold was perhaps some kind of above some kind of threshold that made the commission of the new altarpiece for Monte Cassino need to have some kind of imperial sanction. That, however it's phrased by Leo of Ostia, I think we can read that into it. So I think it's likely then that even private commissions were overseen by the imperial regulators. Now, it may have just been limited to these major commissions, allowing smaller things like Naslav's commission for Mstislav to remain free. But it does, I think, bring us on to think about what we know about imperial workshops. So who is making things and with what kind of control? And for luxury goods, the only place we can really get evidence, apart from the scattered references on people's seals, are the regulations that are set out in the 10th century book of the Epoch, which sets out a series of chapters regulating materials. So it is referring to the 10th century, so that raises problems about how relevant it is a century later, but it's all that we have to go on. So that has one chapter devoted to the regulations for goldsmiths, but that's more concerned about whether your slave is able to work on your behalf and what kind of guarantors he needs. But it has multiple chapters concerned with the making and selling of silks. And the regulation of the silk weavers gives us a lot of useful information. So it prohibits workers from making particular types of cloth. So that in itself would seem to imply the existence of an imperial workshop that could be making those types of cloth, but equally there might be a more implicit, they can't make them without imperial permission, that isn't tacked on in the regulations. And other regulations that do presume that private workshops are making imperial garments are then very clearly required to deposit what they make in the imperial storehouses, so building up that stock of goods that can then be given out to ambassadors. So it does make me wonder whether there were this idea of the imperial workshop with a monopoly on production ever really existed, and that things were rather more open, but with a careful oversight from the Epoch and his co-workers. And you do wonder whether there was enough gold around to sustain any kind of imperial monopoly on enamels, just how much was being made, just however full of the warehouses Selos likes to claim that the Byzantine emperors had. But alongside that, we need to think about the degree to which this hides a perhaps more fragile reality about the nature of the Byzantine economy. Because at the end of his description of all those crowns being put on display for the Umayyad caliphs, Constantine adds perhaps a rather telling final sentence. And he writes that, so we've set out all these enamel crowns in the spaces of the palace, and he then ends saying, note that as customary for a procession, the epoch lined out the tribunal with silks, cloths, and sendals, so silks, and with objects of gold and enamel and chased silver. That is to say, the silver dealers supplied these. Now, I'm still not quite clear what that last phrase refers to, how much of the preceding sentence, but it's clear that to some extent at least, the palace is having to borrow or rent objects from private ownership fully to embellish the spaces of the palace on important occasions. And you only have to think of parallels in the West, like St. Edward's Crown, which for 240 years from its creation to 1911 was only ever fitted with jewels hired for the occasion of coronations, which were then returned to their owners. And it was only in the Edwardian period that we finally had enough money to buy them for ourselves. And that too has parallels in the Byzantine world in the 14th century with the various episodes we have of the pawning of goods, so the pawning of the jewels from the imperial crown by Anne of Savoy in 1341, and then the sale of relics and enamels a decade later by Helena, some of which ended up in Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, including almost certainly the enamels incorporated on the gospel book that they possessed. So I think there's still a sense, the fact they still had enamels in the 14th century gives us an idea that what is in the imperial storerooms might be separate from what is in the private collections of the royal family. But I think it was a much more liquid and dispersed wealth than Byzantine authors themselves would like us to assume. And with that, I want to just turn to one final question about the nature of these as workshop commissions, which has particularly bedeviled the study of the enamels on the Khakhuli Triptych. And that's about a judgment of how do you judge the quality of an enamel. So Klaus Wessel's 1966 book continually emphasizes, and it's an account of the enamel you see on the left there, its poor quality, especially when compared to the plaque of the same emperor on the crown of Hungary. And similarly, Paul Hetherington and even Leila Huskevadze, who is the doyen of enamel studies in Georgia, similarly are prepared to lament the poor quality of the enamel plaque that you see there. Far too inferior is the best short description I can come up with. Now, to some extent, these observations can be supported. There is a clearer blurring of colours between the cloisons on the Khakhuli plaque. So particularly where the black glass of Michael's hair has leaked into the beige used for his face. So not so easily visible, but it is detectable up at the top and down the right side of his face there. Although to a degree you can point to something similar and you wonder whether there perhaps is a more deliberate desire to mix these colours than we normally allow for. Cloisonné enamelling is always thought of as keeping colours entirely separate, but I think there is a little bit more modelling that's being done. But we can also point to the very simple ovals of the cloisons that outline the face of the imperial couple here compared to the slightly crinkly outline that you get to give more moulding to the beard of Michael on the crown. And there's a distinct evident difference in the thickness of the wire used to form the cells, but also in the hues being used. The blues and the greens are slightly less translucent on the Georgian enamel, the rest perhaps less scarlet. Although inevitably this is relying on photographs. You can't get within 5 meters of the crown in Hungary unless you're one particular person, and maybe Orban as well, perhaps, I don't know. But colours notoriously in enamel books are ramped up to 11 to give them that extra wow factor. So I think Summers Wessel's and Huskevadze's observations may be accurate, but I do think we need to reassess the conclusions that they draw from that. So just to quote Wessel, he concludes, "The Hungarian piece was fashioned by the finest craftsmen in the court workshop, whereas an article turned out by the emperor's mass production workers was apparently considered good enough for the Georgian." So he's reinforcing that idea of 2 workshops, the imperial one and then the mass production one. The question is whether we can sustain that. The argument has been extended then to think also about the crown of Constantine IX, which is littered with errors and infelicities in its Greek. And the implication is that then we have distinctions of quality to factor in to idea of Byzantine imperial control as well. That becomes another way of encoding hierarchy into imperial gifts. So the emperor will go to a different workshop depending on how important he thinks his visitor or the recipient will be. And this again is something that has overtaken the study of enamels. So Margaret Fraser, looking at the enamels on the Palladoro, came to the conclusion that the craftsmen got bored when they were doing the inscriptions, ill-spaced and ill-formed. The artist simply dropped letters, is her conclusion. So it's your judgment, is that bad use of Latin, or is it a more decorative form of inscription, the way the letters get doubled up in Alexandria and Marki down here, the very odd way in which the first letter or 2 letters of the following word are always dropped over into the left-hand half of each panel, and so on. And more recently, Scott Redford, in his discussion of the wonderful Artukid enamel dish now in Innsbruck, came to a similar conclusion, that often the Byzantines seem to have kept the best enamels for themselves, presenting works to their allies of restricted palette and less than delicate line, is his slightly more formal account of why he thinks this is a less polished product. So for Wessel, you explain that through the different relationship between Byzantium and Hungary and Byzantium and Georgia in the 11th century, the mighty king of the Hungarians and a foreign ruler of fairly low status is his summary of the two. And those are things I think we could easily challenge. This is, after all, the father of his empress we're talking about in Georgia. Is that really of a lower status? We have just lost most of Anatolia at the Battle of Manzikert. Are the Georgians not a more important ally in the rear of the Seljuk army that the Byzantines would want to be supporting at this period? But this idea of an implicit kind of hierarchy of enamels rests upon this foundational belief that the control of quality rested with the emperor, and that production was nuanced enough to code recipients' position just through the quality of output. So how do we weigh quality against material value? After all, if we just go back for a moment, there is more gold in the enamel on the left than there is on the one on the right. So in simple bullion terms, it cost more to make the enamel that went to Georgia than the one that went to Hungary. But trying to find evidence of how you value quality against quantity is very difficult. And the only one I could find with a link to Byzantium comes bizarrely from the Empress Matilda, so of our parish, so to speak, who writes so Robert of Torigny writes about her gifts to Lebec in 1150, saying that she'd bestowed on Lebec several gifts which were precious, and here's the important bit, on account of their material as well as their make. Byzantium itself would have reckoned them most dear. Even a Greek or Arab traveller in this part of the world would enjoy the same pleasure in seeing them. So interestingly, that even the Holy Roman Empire and into Anglo-Norman world is still thinking in terms of a value level based on Byzantine and Muslim travellers. But that's hardly conclusive evidence about how you evaluate quantity against quality. But I do worry about whether we can find a distinction between the finest craftsmen in the court workshop and the idea of mass production workers. And this is the problem, I think, that I really kind of want to finish with, is trying to work out how we distinguish those things. And where you do find evidence in Byzantium, which again comes from the book of the Epoch, the hierarchical distinction comes from between materials rather than from craftsmanship. So most evidently in some of the lion silks that are now scattered around Europe. This is an example from Rimini. The one I am actually referring to is in Berlin, but it's not in good enough condition. I can't find a good photograph of it. What's interesting about the one in Berlin is it's associated with the Emperors Basil II and Constantine VIII, but the dyes that they used to make it were madder and indigen rather than murex and other finer materials. And Anna Mathesius, in her study of the silks, considered it was an attempt to pass off second-rate materials, again, on unsuspecting Western powers. So she thinks that there's a lower quality of silk that was being manufactured for export rather than for retention in Byzantium. But again, the problem for me is that this is based on the materials being used rather than the execution. The time it took to manufacture these non-murex-based silks was just as long as to make the other ones. Now, these are problems that keep going, that I've dealt with all the enamels that I can really kind of locate, but there are a whole series of other enamels which I think send the picture on in different ways. There's a group of enamels that were stolen from Georgia in the late 19th century. Most of them are now in the Met. They came from an icon from the monastery of Jumati, which is almost certainly 11th century centre with a 13th century frame. So these are enamels which, if they were made in the early 12th century, as is generally presumed, they were then lost effectively for 150 years before reappearing in the late 13th century, where they were then incorporated on this icon. And I think I'm reasonably confident with my argument here. So although this enamel, this icon is lost, as is its pair, we only have an engraving of this one, but we have a photograph, 19th century photograph of its pair, which also was decorated with enamels of the same size, and the two icons were commissioned by brothers, members of the Dadiani family. And when I think so this is Gabriel, this is Michael. I think the Michael icon must have been made second because it incorporates locally made enamels, which I think are attempts to copy the ones that are now in the Met, but without the materials. And I suspect at this stage, they haven't yet redeveloped the expertise to be able to make them to the same quality. So fewer cloisons, much less translucent glass, and much weaker bonding between the glass and the gold ground, so they're in much worse condition. So this is just a kind of a hint at where the story's going. As you can see, I'm flanneling at this point because I haven't really got a conclusion to give you, but it's just trying to show where I've got to so far and hope that you're going to ask me the questions that tell me which direction I should take this in from now. So I think I should stop there before I put my foot in it. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Tony, for a really fabulous lecture and gorgeously illustrated as well. We have some time now before we move through to the research forum, seminar room for some drinks. We have a little bit of time for any questions. So does anybody have a question for Tony? Well, while we think of that, maybe I can try one question, which is just at the very end you talked a little bit about, obviously you talked about workshops, but could you talk about the kind of raw materials and the availability of raw materials in Georgia, for instance, for making enamels like this, or like those ones on the Khakhuli Triptych?
Well, so they have gold coming out of the ground, quite literally, so gold isn't a problem, and glass, they have very strong connections with the Holy Land, which would be one source of glass. But the problem with all this is that the analysis of this material shows you that when you analyse the gold, you find that it's gold that's been reused from endlessly from the past, and when you analyse the glass, it's glass that's been reused endlessly and recoloured. So far the analysis is good enough to be able to tell you whether it's made in 1900 or the Middle Ages, but beyond that it hasn't yet delivered a degree of fineness that's going to be able to establish much more about it. So they can analyse the chemical composition of the glass, but I don't yet know whether that's characteristic enough that you could at least begin to cluster enamels together to show all the ones that have been made with and coloured with one batch of colourant versus another. And that's, I think, kind of, if this is going to progress, it needs to have some kind of technical analysis, but it's working out. I don't yet know what the analysis can show.
Lindy.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. These are probably questions for complete ignorance, and probably you've said this, but how long a period are you thinking that these particular enamels are being produced. I mean, some of them are quite specific because they're tied to particular rulers, and so presumably that puts a date on them. So you had Irene so into the 1140s or something, and then some that were late 11th century. So that's quite a long period for production of these objects. And I just wondered, so some are clearly produced for very particular commissions and things, but how far are they stockpiling these sort of things? I mean, how far does the emperor either in his, in his treasury, in various other, the treasuries of other members of the royal family or the court, how many of these non-specific enamels are likely to be sort of sitting around ready to be, oh, we've got these, we can send them out? I mean,
wouldn't we love to know? I mean, so the period begins in around the end of iconoclasm. There are the series of late 9th, early 10th century enamels, like the Leo one, which are the full enameled objects. Then around 950 they change to these gold background ones, and then you can trace reasonably consistently from the 950s into the 11th century, and then all the way up to 1200-ish. So David Buckton's right that the great enamel icon of the Archangel in Venice, the one full length holding a sword, he thinks can only have been made shortly before the Venetians captured it in 1204. That gives you basically a 250-year span. And then I think then there's a 13th century revival, but they have a different aesthetic. They develop an interest, bizarrely it would seem, given what enamel is good at, but for opaque glass. And so you get a series of objects from the 13th century, so like the St. Demetrius in the British Museum and others, which focus on opaque rather than translucent glass. I think, so these enamels that you see here are dated in the Georgian literature by comparison with the enamels in the Met to being early 12th century. And I think the comparison is the right one, but I think they hadn't thought about when the enamel was available. And I think they only become available in the 13th century, and then there's this sudden explosion. So in Georgia, there's this vast number of enamels that suddenly appear in one small area that is this huge new production. Then Kiev has its own production, primarily of, in fact, since I got you as captive audience. So there is the matrix from which you can make these earrings, and you can kind of map it on. So they're things that you can use to punch out the shape for your enamel. And so they're produced. You must, if there's ever evidence, A, it's non-imperial, B, it's a mass production, then this is it. So I think these things are coming out, but how much there is, I mean, the evidence is it's from Venice and from Georgia. So you look at the treasury of San Marco, and if you're even assuming half of it is stolen, as a conservative minimum, as opposed to the other half that's been collected over 200 years of gift, that gives you some idea of how big a collection that you can build up. And I think the Khakhuli Triptych, that's 12 enamel objects that have been dismantled and put onto one thing. And so that's just two examples that we know of. That suggests that there are large collections going. I think that Pselos story about emptying the storerooms and 3 ships a season going to Georgia, I can kind of believe it. And you think what's lost, just the things we know about that are lost. So Desiderius's altarpiece from Monte Cassino, and what must that have been like? You think, from the top row of the Paladoro, you have the 7 enamels from the Pantocrator monastery. So that's 7 of a minimum of 12, and if that's the decoration of one templon screen from one of 3 churches, you can build. And Paul Hetherington did that. He did an article in which, from his sample of around 1,000 enamels, he kind of did a guesstimate of if you had that as your survival rate, how much do you have to have lost to have ended up with this amount surviving today. And so, but I'm not going to quote what the figure might be because it gets
But it's huge production.
yeah, potentially, but it's over 250 years.
Yeah.
And so what I don't know is how you need to go to the enamel shops in Tbilisi and find out how fast can they churn that stuff out, because it's one of their big market industries. You can go and go around the enamel market and find amazing cloisonné enamels that they're producing today.
Other questions? Well, if there are no further questions, perhaps we can. I can invite you to come through to the research forum for drinks and maybe more informal questions. But perhaps we can first thank Tony once again for.